Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Dan Clayson, and if you just to make sure you're in the right spot this afternoon, I'll be covering the Creating Your Purchasing Playbook, 3 initiatives for any size brewery. So as we have people entering our conference area here, I'll get started very shortly. Obviously, want to make sure we thank some of our partners here as part of the Craft Beer Professional Virtual Conference. Very excited to be participating today. We have 3 sponsors: Aseptic Fruit Puree, the Craft Brewery Financial Training Group, and Sleeman Brewery Lender. So I want to thank everybody for that. It helps keep this great free content that Andrew is producing and we're participating in going. So with that said, we'll dive right in this afternoon for our discussion on a purchasing playbook. Right. So just to go over what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to start off with a brief introduction and then get into our objectives and takeaways. And I really do hope there are some things that you are able to take away. The whole goal of this afternoon, I'll be talking about a playbook, are things that you can put into play into your organization, your brewery, distillery, and choose what something you might be able to start to address and into your organization. And to that end, we've got 3 initiatives that we've laid out and kind of choose for those. As we go, we do have a comments section. So if I see a question and if something I might be covering later on, I might hold that. If not, we can always jump into that so that we can make sure that any questions as they come up do get answered. But just in case at the end, I will hope to leave a few minutes for any Q&A that people have. So with that, just a little bit about myself. As I mentioned at the top, Dan Clayson. I am with the Beer and Wine Federation. We are a GPO or group purchasing organization, and I am the founder of that organization. A couple of things I do like to note: I am not an accountant. I will be focusing and talking about procurement today, but there are definite some things that we talk about in procurement and supply chain that get into areas of accounting. But I always want to make that distinction about what swim lane we're talking about and how that might impact other ones. So you'll hear me as we go note on that is something that you are going to want to check with and talk about what your accounting or your resources on what makes sense for your brewery or distillery. I also mentioned I am not a gardener. It's hard to see a little bit in this picture. In the background there, someone thought it was a good idea to give me a dandelion digger and to start to remove those from the yard. This gets back to kind of know what areas you're good at and what are areas that maybe isn't bringing you a lot of joy. So with that said, a few things of note about myself. My passion lies in purchasing discussions. One of the things for this afternoon: cost-saving models, barbecue, and consuming craft products. Love stopping in at a lot of our members, breweries, wineries, distilleries, and getting a chance to sample that great product. The last thing I will note is what is a GPO, and just a framework for this afternoon to give you a little background on a group purchasing organization for those not familiar with it. But a group purchasing organization is a procurement tool. And I mention this as something that when I talk to people about it, they think that it's something relatively new, and it's quite the opposite. It has been around for a long time, and they've been used in different verticals, not as much in the craft industry, but healthcare and food services and transportation, to name a few. And at the end of the day, a GPO is using membership to pool that purchasing power. And why I mention that and talk a little bit about what a GPO is because what we do as a GPO all day long is talk with our brewery, winery, distillery members, as well as our supply partners about this concept. How can they work together? How can we grow business? How can we make business more lean for our members and saving money, negotiating, working on what provides value? So the whole basis of what we'll be talking about today and give you those initiatives I mentioned comes from what the GPO does on a regular basis. And we wanted to share some of those best practices, some of what's working, quite honestly, what doesn't work. And then that way, hopefully you can take some value in that and take it back to your organization. With that, I talk about the procurement playbook that I mentioned. And any good playbook that we've developed or strategy has that same foundational outline. We want to know what we're trying to do, and then also what is it that we're passing along? How are we going to do it? And that gets into those action items. And lastly, what does success look like? So from my standpoint today, I'm going to be focusing on a playbook that gives you a foundation on 3 initiatives. And that's going to be things that as I mentioned, you can take back to the organization. They're around cost saving strategies. They're very focused on any size brewery or wine or distillery that can use these. It's not tied to making a certain amount of product or being at a certain amount of stage or having X amount of employees. It's really universal initiatives that can pertain to if you're opening your doors soon or you've been in business 5-10 years. And lastly, actionable benchmarking data. So at the end, we'll share some information on some of the benchmarks that we see, some of the data that we see from the industry, and all of that hopefully helps you take that information and apply it to your organization. The last thing is an objective from anyone participating that we hope you have is around cost reduction. And at the same time, an important point is cost reduction without impacting your craft, which is an important point. A lot of times when I'm talking to someone about procurement or saving money, the discussion sometimes goes to that the goal of procurement is to always go with the cheapest solution or always go with something that is subpar and it's cheap to save money. And as I talk to a tremendous amount of brewery, distillery owners, we are aware of that people have pride in what they're making and that, there's due diligence around what's going in and ingredients and the quality and care. And so that to make sure there isn't that distinction, really, procurement services is about trying to add value while saving costs, but also being a part of the team that makes sure that you're not sacrificing quality for cost. So an important point there, and part of our objective as well, is to be talking about cost savings that still makes you able to have that high quality of your product. With that said, we'll jump right into the initiatives here. So, and I'm making sure too, again, I'm just a reminder, I've got our comments section open, and if you have any as we go, by all means, let me know. So our first initiative is to get organized. And this becomes the foundation of the playbook. And it may sound like an oversimplification of a step 1, but it's absolutely paramount to start at this area of getting organized and getting organized from a procurement strategy standpoint. What do I mean by that? The key to a supply discussion around what are we getting, where are we getting it from, is that procurement 101. And why it's important to do that is any cost saving measure is going to need to understand this information before you can look at affecting it. So to give you an example, if you don't have an area within your organization where you understand what you're getting your tap handles for, or what you're getting your perhaps it's your floor mats for your tap room, or your I'll go so granular as light bulbs, or maybe it is where you're getting your pallets or chemicals from. In a procurement model, it's very hard to understand where potential savings lie. So that's why the organization is so key. There's no plan of action if you don't have that starting point or a foundation of information. And the challenge is that we talk to so many different organizations, and I, being a small business owner myself, understand this, is that information probably exists in so many different areas. You might say some of that is in QuickBooks. You might say some of that is in our brewery management software. Some of that is in a stack of invoices on my desk that I haven't seen in 3 weeks, right? It exists, but all over the place. And that's a real challenge we see. And a lot of times it's organizations that start off with perhaps 1 or 2 individuals. And now as they've grown, the challenge has grown with that. So that's a starting point, very common. What we talk a lot about is a feeling of, it's an elephant, right? So how do you start eating that elephant? You're definitely not going to take 2 days off from all the other hats that you wear and start to organize your procurement activities into something. So what we talk about is create a template and chip away at this process and start getting that information over weeks and months. What we have, for example, is a template on our website, and I'll briefly show you where that is. And then this site will be this platform will be available after the fact, the slides. And the goal of this template is a starting point. You can develop your own. You can take a look at that and see some of the information. And this is just an area to say, this document is a procurement document. And I'll quickly try here, and we'll do this together, where I'm going to actually jump out and show you on our site where you can go download this. I've gone to the Beer and Wine Federation under our services, and I've gone down here to a free pricing sheet. And that's something you can see here, and you can download this. Again, you feel free to use this template, other procurement templates. When I show you an example of this here, I've jumped into the template, and by no means are we going to go far into this document here. And it might feel like a little bit overwhelming, but as I mentioned, this isn't something you would sit down in an afternoon and fill out. This is the way you start to eat that elephant. This document is the starting point of trying to get at your cost per product, per line item. And this is different than accounting templates you might have, inventory templates you might have. This is a procurement template. So as I just show you basic what this organizes is, and you might be thinking to yourself that you have this information I mentioned all over the place, but you have a few different categories of equipment. This example is merch and ingredients and services and package material. And then you have the information of who are we getting it from, how much are we getting, and what is that per unit cost. And this information is really where the starting idea starts to come from. We have organized procurement information for the playbook. So that's that first initiative. As I mentioned, this is a great way to get started. As we go, we'll talk about how you use this information. And a lot of times I talk with breweries who know a few of these off the top of their head. They can tell me where they get their cans for and how much. They can talk about where they get their pack tech caps and for how much, and maybe the hops and malt. But if you look at all the categories I'm sure you have in your organization, after maybe you can rattle off maybe 10, maybe 5, it really starts to be something you want to have documented, because then this starts to be the tool that you use over time to have a procurement strategy that drives down cost. And this key component of understanding that individual is the basis for that. So again, a resource to use on our site, to use for that, or go out there on the internet and find some of them. The key is however you want to get started, just to get started. With that, we'll jump back over to the presentation here and put that in a higher mode here. We can see that a little better. Great. So the goal, again, small piece at a time, is how we start to eat that elephant. The next, as we start, this was a slide as a backup in case that didn't work. So we'll move here. Is the second initiative, start negotiating. This is another area for procurement. A lot of the organizations we talk to do not have a dedicated procurement resource. When you have 5, 10 people working within your brewery, let's say, everyone's wearing a lot of hats. So having that one procurement person who would be doing the negotiation falls usually on that owner, general manager, or the tap room manager. And this is the next step that we talk about, why it's important for negotiation, and really where a lot of people typically don't want to have this conversation. But the negotiation is key to helping with the challenges and headwinds that are going to continue for the industry. Everyone seems very well aware of the fact that the growth that was happening in 2014, 2015 is really flattening out. And so this is another area and necessity to have those negotiation conversations with your partners. And I say true partners in here as a starting point. People you've probably been working with for a long time, and to have a conversation that's different than this is what I need this week or everything's fine, is having a negotiation. The second thing we talk about is the challenge of negotiation. I hear this from people and have experienced it myself too. Don't like negotiating. They feel they are not good at it. They all seem to have that perception of, negotiation has a stigma of it's an annoyance, let's say, something they don't feel comfortable with. When they do negotiate, a lot of times people go right to a conversation about cost. And lastly, I hear this a lot, that they've been working with someone for years and they don't want to disrupt that friendship with a conversation, a negotiation conversation. So a lot of times what we're early on introducing some of our members to, talking to breweries about, is how they can start negotiating. And a lot of times I share what's worked well and hasn't worked well for us as a starting point. And so when you look at, again, this, how do you eat the elephant? Some people are surprised that I talk about a different approach to negotiating. And I used to think, being in sales for years, that I was a decent negotiator. I would have given myself maybe a 7 out of 10, and because it was all about cost, and I felt like that I was able to get those opportunities closed. It was only after taking a look at negotiation and working with some different classes and reading some different books, I realized that I was actually not good at negotiating, and looking back, probably give myself more of like a 1 or a 2. And one of the things that really we talk about with negotiation, and we're talking with our members about, is thinking what the negative perception of what negotiation is. A lot of times people either talk about buying a used car and the game that goes on between having to talk with your manager and going back and forth, or this big high stakes office building environment where there's $1 billion deal going on, a show, a TV show, secession, whatever you think of for negotiation, but these high stakes deal. When in reality, we're actually all negotiating on very smaller things. None of us will probably participate in that $1 billion, executive boardroom environment. And so the keys that we talk a little bit about with negotiation and recommend to brewers to put in their toolbox here are to stop thinking about that as negotiation, that negative negotiation. Start simple, start with things that you can start doing tomorrow, and start to get comfortable with what you consider to be negotiation. And I'll give you some examples here. One of the things that we talk about is, from a procurement standpoint, is moving from credit card to a net 60 discussion with some of your supply partners. And this accomplishes a couple of different things. One, it starts getting you comfortable asking and saying, this is something I want to still work with you, but we'd rather switch from a credit card. Can you send me information on your terms program? As well as starting off with the standard mostly for that or supplier is going to be net 30. And net 30, just to recap, would be how long they want you to pay. So you'll send them a PO, and then in 30 days, they'll expect payment. But asking for net 60 is an example of a negotiation. You're saying, I want to work with you, but I would prefer a net 60. That net 60, giving you an additional 30 days, will benefit your brewery's cash flow. So it has a positive impact to your procurement, to your accounting, that your accountant you can talk more about with on that, but they'll go over the benefits. They'll always 9 times out of 10 will be very appreciative of more increased cash flow. But it is an example of starting that negotiation conversation and being prepared for no. And it's not a pricing discussion, but you at least start the conversation. If you have 25 vendors, let's say, and every couple of weeks they're calling in and asking how you're doing, and you're asking to get on terms with some of those, that might be a thing that once a month you switch from a credit card engagement to a net engagement, and then try to get to a net 60 engagement. And you can see that these are examples of everyday communication. They are considered negotiation, but they shouldn't make you feel as a brewer that you're, it's adversarial. It's being more working with your partners, as I mentioned at the top. We talk about more transparency and with current suppliers. That's another negotiation tool, is the conversations a lot of people think about from a negotiation and a procurement discussion is it's always you hold your cards very close to you, and you don't share information. You don't share what you might be thinking for the next step. And a lot of times what we have found is just the opposite, is that when a partner calls and you are having discussions and they're doing that check-in that everybody has had, saying, how are things going? What do you need? You don't need anything right now. You talk about, we're struggling in this area, and we're wondering, do you have any other, programs you might be able to offer? So what you're doing with that supply partner is you're giving them some homework. I think we can all think of a good partner that we've had and who has been proactive. And that's really what you're trying to do with a lot of your partners is negotiating. You're saying, I'm not talking to you today about an order. I'm not talking to you today about a cost change. You called to see how things were, and I'm telling you that we've been having some inventory issues where we don't have the room, but is there anything you can do? Or we've started to see a competitor offer free shipping. I don't know if that's something that in the future you can do. I'm just sharing with you what we're seeing and some of the challenges we're coming up against here. That is that transparency that 9 times out of 10 they're already aware of, but gives a good supply partner the ability to go back, work with their team, and then follow up with you with this is something we might be able to do. So that break down some of that holding information in and be more sharing back and forth creates a good negotiation that most people think is not true negotiation. One example of this too is sharing forecasting. I work with so many different brewery distillery members that they do have the back of the napkin, as they say, about what they think they might be doing this month or next year. And that's something that is a part of what they're looking at. And that can be something of value that you can share with your partners. It doesn't mean they're necessarily going to get all that business of pallets or chemicals or ingredients or cans, but it does talk about this is what we're seeing, this is what I'm looking at, and I want to see what you can do with that information. So often owners are calling or working with their supply partners, and it's such a cost discussion. Can you lower your price? And they're ready for that. And the answer, that's no, and here's why. Right? So when we talk about negotiation and transparency, we talk a lot about sharing information. So before we get into cost discussion of saying this is what we're anticipating doing this year, that allows a good partner, again, to go back, work with their team and saying, this is what we have with this partnership. This is what we're expecting. They're not going to do it all at once, but at least they were able to share some of their forecast information. Is there anything we can do to continue to earn that business? And so when you're talking about a conversation around value, that really is the heart of it. And that's my last point, is focusing on value when you're talking about negotiation. If anyone's interested, there is a book I've put down here that kind of has more on these different concepts. It very much is in line with how the industry communicates. And I am relatively new in the last couple of years to the industry. But as you can see from the title, when you talk about negotiation, it's this idea of relationships, of partnerships, on sharing information about how we can grow together and trying to make people more comfortable with the concept of negotiation so that they can see that in their organization. And the last thing I'll say about this is that when we've seen people do it successfully, to start small. And that's why I give some examples of here. Start to create a habit of asking partners about net 60 terms, or sharing forecasting and asking them what they can do, or sharing concerns. Start to build up those examples and then look over it month over month and start to see some examples of where we were able to negotiate a win. So often there's a focus on price. And as I mentioned before, they ask for a better price, they don't get it, and they kind of move on and don't build off of that or ask again. And it doesn't start to become something that they can use, or a club in their bag, if you will. So the last initiative here that we talk about is to operationalize the playbook we talked about. So just as a quick recap, we talked about foundationally you have the organized data, and we have that template, and however you have that information organized, what that could look like. Now we understand our procurement line item categories, cost structure, and that becomes the basis of it. And second, we're starting to have conversations with our supply partners around concepts of negotiation, how we can start to change our relationships with those supply partners and start to get the most value out of them, which is our second initiative. And the third is to create a program within your organization that is similar to your sales program. or running lean. And this is about a couple of different concepts of how do you start to make small changes using these types of procurement initiatives, and then be able to, over time, let's say 6, 12 months, look back and say that we didn't do this all at once. In fact, I would say that any organization that tries to do this in a weekend would fail. This is meant to be something that week over week, month over month, you're just picking that one or two things to start incorporating, and then look back at it after a year and say, we're able to measurably make some impacts by putting this into place. Why it's important. A lot of the large organizations who have dedicated procurement teams, both within procurement and sales, talk about these initiatives the same way they do large sales. So in a large company, the sales is considered the driving force, and procurement reductions and cost savings get a second amount of visibility, still a lot of visibility, to say we were able to impact our profit because we sold X, but we were also able to save Y. And when we talk to small organizations that don't have a dedicated procurement individual, which is expected, and you have other people wearing different hats, there's still a lot of discussion around growth, but there's rarely a discussion about cost saving measures. And that's what running lean really is. Starting to understand what the program is, starting how you're measuring it, and then start to give it the same focus that you would on sales. And the one thing I will mention that I want to make sure that we're not advocating here, this isn't an either or discussion. This isn't about not trying to move from 500 barrels to 1,000 or 1,000 to 2,000. The great thing about these programs is you're doing them in parallel. Still work on your growth strategy. That's great. But with a procurement strategy like this, and working on this and adding to it and viewing it almost like a sales, you can have that same impact to profit. I'll say it another way, is if you did 1,000 barrels last year and you do 1,000 barrels this year, with that procurement cost savings method, you can look at making that same 1,000 barrels more profitable. Really work on combating some of the challenges that everyone's facing these days with inflation and supply issues all around that. And that's why it's critical to have a program like this and to start to build it and start small, and then look back over a year or two and say, wow, we weren't even having those conversations with our supply partners 2 years ago, and now this is where we're at. But it took time. The challenge, and I go back to this with a lot of different team members that we talk to, is I mentioned a little bit, is there continues to be a focus on just growth, and that there isn't enough room or oxygen in the room to talk about both. You can have growth and continue to be mindful of where you're saving by using procurement strategies to drive down costs in different areas. Some organizations don't think of cost savings as a high priority. That's that mindset I kind of touched on. When you're seeing double-digit growth, 2014, 2015, 2016, that really wasn't a high priority, because it was probably a calculation of, if we spend this much time working on sales growth, we can see this much growth. Where you can only, so much time in the day, are you going to be spending that time on cost savings metrics? But now, as I talked about before, with some of the challenges of growth, really to start that second engine, use the procurement cost savings as another engine. The last one I'll mention is something I commonly hear, that our cost savings program is something our accountant does, or we think that's what they do. And I will say this, they might be the case. Every organization is different, but many times there's a disconnect that the accounting team is responsible for cost saving measures. And a lot of the accounting teams we talk to and interact with, their role is different. It is to make sure that the money owed is going out, that the money received is coming in, the balance sheet, the P&L, cash flow are all part of their taxes, all part of their core responsibilities. Where you don't hear or see a lot where that they have that procurement template that I talked about, and that they're thinking actively is, how do we get, are we paying the right per unit for our chemicals? Are we paying the right per unit for our consumables, napkins and toilet paper in our tap room? Are we getting the best value for our tap handles? That usually falls through the cracks in an organization that we work with when you're talking about a smaller, under 20, 35, type of number of employees. So that's just sometimes a disconnect, and that can be a challenge because everyone's thinking that someone else might be doing that. So we touched on how we operationalize and run lean, or make this part of your DNA. And I use that phrase because I've heard it from some of the different breweries we've met with, in that they talk about, quality control is something that's very important to them, or fresh ingredients. There's things that are part of their DNA, their organization, whatever that might be. And they said it took time as they brought on new people to make sure that they recognized that that was, a fun tap room environment, something that was unique. This is how we like to operate. So it takes time. And when new people come on board, they're aware that this is part of who we are. This is what we're trying to do. And maybe it's stressing that, yes, we're trying to be mindful of our purchases because we want to be around 5 years from now making that great beverage. So explaining that we do need to plan out a little bit. We can't always be jumping on Amazon to do a last minute overnight order because we forgot to do something, because that has a cost. That has a premium, and a small, a million paper cuts is the expression, is that it's really not the larger orders. It's sometimes those smaller orders that are a premium time over time. So making it part of your DNA is another part of operationalizing, running lean. A couple of metrics to mention: our starting point, and something we talk with others. Feel free to use this, and always love feedback as you're, I'll share my information or you're at events. I'm always interested on some of the starting point of how people are seeing this when they put this into practice. But we recommend 7% for most categories as a floor, if you will. What do we mean by that? It means that when you're starting your discussions, and eventually they will get to price, as much as I've said, don't start with price, but you'll be talking about value and inventory, and you're trying to understand where should we spend our time and energy on a procurement strategy. And so one of the things I see is that people rank where they spend the most money, and they start off, and that's where they begin. You can do that. You can start with your cans. You can start with your ingredients. But I would recommend having that awareness of where it is, and then perhaps start lower tiered items. Why? Because there can be a learning curve to this. You can start to have better conversations. You can have conversations about value, about inventory, about how you can help them and they can help you, and learn on some of the more medium to smaller items with your organization, and still save 10, 15, 20% in those discussions. So most of the categories, I use the example as if you're having a 5% savings conversation on Post-it notes, it's probably not the best use of your time. With a caveat. And that brings up our second data point, is 3% on other categories still can be very much worth it. So Post-it notes was the example of where you should move on, but 3% on things of high volume. So what you're spending a lot on and getting a lot of. And let's use cans as an example, or packing supplies, what have you. 3% on something that you're doing a large volume will have a big impact. So that's where the caveat is something of note. Also, things that have a high scarcity. So as many of you know, going through issues with CO2, malt as an example of something that when scarcity is high and the suppliers have a lot of the leverage, if you will, being able to get even small changes in pricing on those items, even if you're not buying a lot of them, still should count as a win to your program. because of that. So that's to help as people are starting to have these conversations. It is really know where you're spending your time and effort, and then you can start to track that over time and look back, as we mentioned it, over 12 months, let's say, and say, in this month, we talked to 3 vendors, and we're able to average, get a 10% impact. The next month, we were able to talk to these 2 vendors and get on net 60 terms. This month, we were able to talk to this person and talk about, save 7% in our tap room environment. Those impacts will add up and give you that feeling of, are you spending the right amount of time and energy? And now I'll bring back in the accountants, who will then start to see that impact on things like your balance sheet and your P&L. That's really the handoff of this exercise of running lean will start to show up the quantifiable impact in your accounting documents. And you work with your accountants ahead of time as you're going through and start to say, let's make sure we can track this at the end of the year, because I want to know if we're having these conversations that we're getting 7, 10, 15% here, or we're getting that value of perhaps it's help with delayed inventory or warehousing fees or reductions in programs and shipping. And there's just a variety of different things your supply partners might be able to do. The last thing we'll say is part of this initiative and running lean. I have been talking to a few breweries who are in the same spirit of transparency, been opening this up to their employees and having conversations. How are we doing? How is the tap room performing? We're at 80% compared to 2015, 2016. We're looking for ways to bring more people in the door. That's that growth engine that never changes. But we're also looking for ideas on ways to improve our costs. So if people have ideas, bring those through, and the owner and the GM and the tap room managers can evaluate those. But it really, I've heard some great suggestions that have come from some of the team members, sometimes new team members, who are saying, I was at another brewery and this is how they did. So make that part of the DNA, as we mentioned. It can really give that visibility into our goal. As I go back to our top objective, is to find cost savings metrics without sacrificing our craft, and make sure we're around 5 years from now still making that beautiful beverages. And that comes back to the goal of that. So hopefully these 3 initiatives, plus with the template, helped give that framework. This is how you move from a strategy, some action items, into a program that becomes part of a playbook that you can start to develop internally. So I have here my contact information. We have it at dan@beerwinefederation.com. If you have questions, by all means, love questions on what you might be trying to do, what you're seeing at different events that we are at, CBC, for example, in Nashville coming up. But really would love to be a resource, especially if you're hitting a wall with trying to implement any of these. Happy to pass on more information on what others are doing, or connect you perhaps with a different brewery in the area. It's sometimes very interesting and exciting to see where 2 breweries can talk and about what's working and what's not. And we can step out of that conversation as well. So any information we can have. I will open it up in the comments section to anything, questions, or anything that you might not have seen, or I might have gone over a little too quickly. Happy to answer anything on this end. All right. Well, if there are no questions, again, you've got my information. If people feel more comfortable offline, feel free to send me an email. But appreciate the time and wish everybody good luck. And like I said, feel free to reach out, and good luck implementing this at your organization. Thanks again.